All right. So this is going to be something a little bit different. This is something I've been thinking about quite a bit since I played through Metroid Dread the first time, which is that this is the most story, I think, just period, that we get in the entire series, really. The most like explicit exposition, and definitely the most exposure that we get to like actual Chozo characters. And they don't just speak English, which is kind of neat. They went as far as to, well, that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. Like, what did they do? So I guess I should have started this with spoiler warnings. Whoops. But we're going to talk a little bit about. We're going to show some mid-game stuff here. But yeah, I remember kind of early on with some of the preview materials that came out, people were trying to figure out, because I think they showed the main villain, and he has a little line that he says there, and somebody must have thrown it into Google Translate, and it came back as like, I don't know, maybe that's Turkish, and it's not. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Also, Google Translate, like, guess what language this is thing works better the more you feed into it, because it's really just it's running a statistical analysis and taking its best guess, right? Like there's no real magic behind it. It's just math. So it would have, for example, it would probably have a pretty hard time distinguishing a lot of, like, Swedish from Norwegian, for example. Unless you got the right kind of telltale things, because those languages are pretty close together. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. It's not Turkish. It's also not gibberish, though, which is kind of cool. Yeah, why don't we? Well, I pulled a bunch of footage from the game, including the cutscene in question, to kind of talk over it. But why don't we take a look at the first little bit, just to give you an idea of what it's like. Here we go.
Anaman Henki Maradis, Pisalakutar Ili Thoja Hasana, Ili Chozo Manfaragai Atasen Maburis, Ashkar Behek, Ninu Gabara Neporien Levat Palis Hemniku, Hemsen Ili Tanumar Tarbi Chozo Rahama Hasana, Maburis Ili Maukin.
All right, so if you really listen to that, it might be obvious straight away what it is, but if it's not, it's English, right? Except for all the words. And here's kind of what I mean by that. So if you think about, hello, dog wants to be in the video as well. If you think about things like, any fantasy or sci-fi, like Star Wars does this. They go a little bit further than what I'm about to suggest, but they do this where they've got their own alphabet, but at the end of the day, it's really basically just the Roman alphabet that we use to write English in, and they're using it to write a bunch of, what a galactic standard or whatever they call their version of English, but it's just English at the end of the day, right? It's another way to write a pre-existing language. This is basically the same thing, except instead of letters, they've just swapped out all the words for alien-sounding words, but all the grammar and everything underneath, for the most part, is just English. So the way that you go about figuring something like that out, if it wasn't something that just was immediately evident to you, is thankfully this particular clip is, this character speaks kind of slowly and deliberately. You can tell that they probably recorded it a line at a time in a way that lines up exactly with the subtitles that are on the screen. So there's a good, like, here is this chunk of language, pause. Here is this next chunk of language, pause, and so on and so forth. So you get really good, especially for things at the beginnings and ends of those utterances, you get really good, clear, defined examples of some of those words. For example, we'll play a little bit more here. If you watched this whole clip and couldn't figure out what the word for however was, then you just weren't paying attention. Like, I think it comes up in about another 10 seconds. Oh wait, I skipped back.
Chozo Rahama Hasana Maburis Ilimaukin Saharilin Ilimaukin Pinoras Hasana Tarvili Chozo Urairisi dos Karodan Ilimathroe Nirmugi Talar Suradis Me Ili Agar Nalima Uramahar Pantamugi dos Salal Pura Mathroe Kunihabari Hundar Tarasabekes en Holchanim Linkatalu Ili Uliris Sabalba.
Right. So some of it's really easy to figure out, like that one particular word, for example. But if you have trouble with the rest of it, the things to listen for are, one, just the general pacing and cadence, right? And if you read the subtitles as you're kind of listening to what's the noises that he's making, and in particular pay attention to things like proper nouns, right? Where, if it had been gibberish, right, it would have just been every time he mentioned, Metroids or the Thoha tribe or whatever the case may be, you wouldn't have heard the same sound over and over again, right? It probably just would have been some other random string of sounds, kind of like the Sims speaking Simlish, right? None of it means anything. It's got a lot of emotionality and it's got cadence like it's speech, but it's just noises, right? This is different, and you could tell because you've got those landmarks with, proper nouns and things like that. So with that in mind, if you listen through the first little bit again, you ought to be able to pick up pretty quickly on the definite article, right? The word for the, because there's a lot of proper nouns that are all preceded by the. And this was kind of, when I was listening to this my first time, this was my first clue that, okay, this is just English, right? Because every noun phrase was an English noun phrase. And you could kind of fill in the gaps in between there and realize very quickly that, okay, all of this word order is just English word order. And even languages that are very closely related to one another will often have wildly different word order. So it's really suspicious, to say the least, that, if this had been Turkish, which has very different word order from this, it doesn't, like Turkish, the Turkish verb for to be, right? That's one of the biggest telltale signs that this was not Turkish was the example that they pulled out of the trailer or whatever, was just a simple, what's called a copula, right? Which is a fancy linguist word for a sentence that has the verb to be in it, right? The house is green. It is sunny. Whatever. It's basically like an A equals B equation for natural language. Anything that has that form is called a copula. But in Turkish, the verb to be is not its own separate word. It's actually a suffix that gets attached to, I think it gets attached to like nouns and adjectives. I don't know much Turkish. I know a very little bit about the grammar. All that to say, it would have showed up in different spots in the sentence that it does, if you listen very closely to the way that this Chozo guy talks. To say nothing of the fact that if you listen a little bit closer and you can pick out the past tense form in a couple of these areas, you can see that it's different. It's a form that does not exist in Turkish, so it's definitely not Turkish. But anyway, going back to the original point, which was, see if you can listen and pick up on what is the word for the, just the. So listen to all of those proper nouns in particular, right? And see if you can pick up on the word that comes right before them.
Inaman Henki Maradis. Pisalaku tar ili thoja hasana. Ili Chozo man faragai atasen maburis ashkar behek. Ninu kabara neporien levat balis heuniku. Hemsen ili tanumar tarbi Chozo rahama hasana maburis ili maukin.
So if you know what to listen for, you know to kind of anticipate the pattern. It's pretty easy to pick out that you've got something like ili there is the word for the, right? And then the next step, once you've picked up on that, and you go, well, that's suspicious because not even every language has, definite and indefinite articles. There's a lot that you can just sort of pick out from, some languages depend entirely on context for you to decide whether something is a definite or an indefinite noun. And if you're not entirely sure on what I mean by that, it's the versus the distinction in English, right? So he gave me a book versus he gave me the book, right? If I say he gave me the book, there's some history there, right? That's a particular book that we're talking about. It's not just any old book that he found in a library or on the street, wherever you find books these days, right? But a book, he gave me a book. It could be anything. It's not necessarily, maybe I wasn't even asking for a book. I had no idea he was going to give me a book. But the book, it's a particular one, right? But anyway, once you pick up on that and you realize like, okay, that's kind of suspicious, then you start looking for, well, what are all of these other words that pop up very frequently in language, or at least in English, right? In this case, we're suspecting that this is English, so we might as well let's use that as our starting point. And what are other words that pop up a lot in English? Well, there's conjunctions, right? Look at this one subtitle here. We've got and shows up twice, the shows up a bunch. Prepositions are going to show up a lot. The verb to be is going to show up a lot, right? So if we just keep listening for those things, we'll be able to pick out more and more. And from there, you can kind of just, what I eventually did was I just transcribed a huge chunk of this. There are a couple of parts that are kind of hard to understand over the kind of music swells and things. But once you kind of parse it all out and you kind of get where you can once you pick out a couple of words, you can kind of figure out where other words must start and end, right? And you can kind of tease it all apart from there. Pronouns. Pronouns are another good example, right? So he is going to show up a lot. He spends a whole lot of time talking about this other character, Ravenbeak, right? Ashkar Behek, which it's kind of funny that the word for beak in Chozo is just Behek. That's pretty darn close. But also, that totally happens in real life. A funny little anecdote is, in English, we don't actually know where the word dog came from. Because for most Germanic languages, right, the dog word is hound, right? It's some version of hound. But in English, that's been restricted to, like, a hound is kind of a hunting dog. It's a particular kind of working dog, right? And we've had dog take over as the generic, all four-legged, floppy-eared canine pets. So that's weird, right? And people have proposed all sorts of theories over the years as to where this word dog might have come from. It's there. It's not very prevalent way back, but it's there all the way back in Old English. But nobody knows where it could have come from. At the same time, on the other end of the planet, there's an Aboriginal Australian language that I'm completely blanking on the name of. But it just so happens that the word for dog in that language is dog. Now, that doesn't mean that we borrowed the word dog from that Aboriginal Australian language. That would require some pretty heavy duty evidence of contact between people in England and people in Australia, well before people in England, I think, even knew that Australia existed. But it's just a product of there's only so many sounds that you can make with a mouth. And so there's only so many combinations of those sounds that you can put together and assign meaning to. So with enough languages all across the world on a large enough span of time, you're bound to end up having two completely different languages that are unrelated to one another come up with the same word for the same thing at some point. And it just so happened that it's dog in this case. Still don't know where it came from. It's fun to think that maybe we both got it from the same place, but probably not. Anyway, yeah, let's talk about pronouns, because this is actually one of the places where this language that they've built, which again, as I said, it's basically just English, right? Essentially what they did is they wrote a dictionary of just Chozo words, and they did a like find and replace, right, on the English script, and then had a voice actor read it, and he does a good job. He's relatively consistent. There are a couple of spots where I think they maybe could have used another take or two, but he's pretty consistent. So the pronouns are a little bit different, because if you think about the way pronouns work in English, it's really the main place, not the only place, but it's pretty much the only place where we still have grammatical case, by which I mean you can look at a pronoun and you can tell straight away whether it's a subject, an object, or possessive, right? So if it's he, right, it's a subject. If it's him, it's an object. Either it's direct object, indirect object, or object of a preposition, right? And if it's his, then that's possessive form, right? That would have been genitive way back in the day, but that's not even really a concept for us in English anymore. And that genitive s, the fact that his ends with an s is not a coincidence either. That genitive s is a Germanic thing that's present across all Germanic languages, and we've held on to it in English in the pronouns, and then also in the nouns, right? That's the one place where we see a little bit of inflection is with possessive, and you get that genitive s with the apostrophe s to denote that, hey, this thing is a possessing noun. But Chozo works a little bit differently. I'll see if I can find a couple of the clips here, but I'll go ahead and not bury the lead here. Chozo inflects even less, right? So it does not care whether a pronoun is the subject or an object. It's always the same. It doesn't care what it is. It's always the same. So that very first thing that Quiet Rope says, Anaman Henki Maradis, or whatever his name translates to, right? Anna is the I pronoun, but Anna is also me, and Anna is sort of my also, but we'll get to that in a minute. But the first thing is to kind of let's see if we can find. I think he will probably be the best one to go with, because he talks about Ravenbeak a lot, and there's a lot of he and him and his. So let's see if I can find my way back to that spot. Yeah, here we go.
Anaman Henki Maradis, Pisalakutar ili Thoja Hasana, ili Chozo Manfaragai Atasen Maburis, Ashkar Behek, Ninu Gabara Neporien.
So did you hear that right away? Right there, we've got the pronoun. Again, the great thing about having these very deliberate pauses between each of these subtitles here is that straight away we get a dead giveaway for what the he pronoun is. So Ninu, and then Gabara is possesses, but Ninu is the he, right? And so let's keep listening, because he's going to talk about him some more, and there should be a him and possibly even a his in there, and see if you can pick out that Ninu again. It's also kind of interesting that they say Metroid a lot. There's not a lot of T's in this phonology. Like the phonology also seems relatively consistent, although I do have some questions about how some of it is supposed to work with a bird person. But anyway, I think we're getting to the he him part, or the he his part.
Ashkar behek, hasari gale ubana dosh delegar mir. Ninu barash nek ili ferun dar hadar. Les ninu kedar.
So that's one inconsistency there. They actually don't mark possession on that particular pronoun, but they do mark it everywhere else. So a little spoiler for the next bit.
Metroid movie. Tanam darbi hadar bunta. Eiris dosh eka ili gimel. Ashkar behek gabori dosh balan ili Metroid dosh ili tarin nalima hemsatar. Humbin bi kalki sakra. Dosh horek bura. Ninu mehirin ili zoha hasana. Bimura gabara ili sahali. Doshuran ili Metroid. Galmir tostek. Ananakoden mugi akalai. Ashkar behek hem ili maukin. Hasana hasari anabalta dosh.
That goes by pretty quick, so you might not have heard that, but there's a me in there. See if you can hear it, because it's just Anna, and right for that purpose alone, I alone was spared. It's an Anna there, and it's going to be an Anna at the me part as well. Right, he almost buries it. That anabaldadosh, right? Also, dosh, you'll hear, is the preposition for two. You'll get it here as well. It's both the preposition and the infinitive marker, which again is a dead giveaway that this is probably English, right? Because English always marks its infinitives, and it always marks them with two. A lot of languages will just have their infinitive form because it's distinct from all the finite forms of the verb, and they don't need a separate marker. But English does, because the only inflection that we have on our verbs is third person singular, right? I continue, you continue, he continues, he, she, it continues, they continue, so on and so forth. And if you don't know what the infinitive is, that's basically that's a kind of a fancy way to say the dictionary form of the verb, right? If you look up a verb, that's the form that you're going to be looking for, because it's the form that doesn't have any endings or anything added onto it yet. It's its uninflected form, right? That's what infinite really means. It's not finite. It has not been defined by its ending, by adding morphology onto it. So sorry, let me skip back 10 seconds. And so yeah, you'll hear a lot of ili in here, right? For the, you'll hear Anna baltarosh, right? Will get buried in there. And then the dosh, you'll hear a couple examples of dosh being two, both the preposition and the infinitive marker, which is more signs that this is English.
Sabalba, talaris le shak sirugali nevak, hemmugi lamai dos goro humahar yoris me kohana. Aitarili gelsu manu naloni ishka ili agarna lima, mugi garama bi eris les nido. Ili tarin nalima megori le shakutanka. Ontar humahar gelsu mugi barilin ilieris. Arek ebores ashkar behek elemeirisi dos karodan hum. Ninu aros hakame.
Here we go.
Inumahar meheni
dos tume. I talked over that completely, but here's the bit. It's further in than I thought, but whatever. I love this cutscene, so I don't mind watching it again. So he then turned his thoughts to resuming his plan, right? You got a he, you got a his, and you got another his. So if you remember the he word is ninu, right? You're going to hear ninu 3 times. But on the second two, you're also going to hear basically what Chozo does is it has a particle that it sticks at the end of a pronoun to denote that it is possessive, which is essentially what we do with our apostrophe s on nouns, right? It would be a little bit like if we just used that apostrophe s everywhere. And so it wasn't he and his, it was he and he's, and it wasn't she and her, it was she and she's. That it would be like that. And the Chozo appears to be very regular. We don't have any she's in here, so maybe that, goes off the rails and does something completely different. It's entirely common for pronouns in a language to be wildly irregular. It's not always the case, but it's not uncommon at all. And that's not because they're used so often, but also kind of because they're used so often. It's one of those things that if you're gonna have irregular patterns in your language, they're gonna hang around in the areas where you use them most often. So pronouns get used all the time. They are super core to a language, which is why you almost never see languages borrow pronouns from other languages. It just doesn't happen, right? Because they're so core to, like, they encode the person that you're speaking the language to, right? It's a conversation is two people. It's me and you, and those words that describe that are just like every language has them. Obviously, they're very, very core. They can change over time, but they almost never get borrowed from other languages. Anyway, yeah. So let's go back here and listen for our Ninu for he, and then our two hises. Right, so it's that machar, right? So Ninu machar is his. So Ninu is he, right? Ninu basically just means third person singular, as far as I can tell, masculine, right? And then machar says, oh, by the way, this thing is possessing whatever noun comes after it. There'll be a couple more examples of that. There were some examples earlier as well, but you'll be able to pick up on that as well. That's another. So you may have also picked up some on. This is one of the places where the subtitles don't really match up with the what he's saying. So, for both SR388, the two planets that he's talking about, for both SR388 and ZDR, he says ili, and then another word, and then nalina, which sounds suspiciously like the adjective noun. And it's nalina for both of them, but that middle word is different, which makes me think it's probably, and as far as I've been able to tell, that middle word, the middle word that he uses for ZDR and the middle word that he uses for SR388, doesn't show up anywhere else in any of his utterances, so we don't have a definition of it in the subtitles anywhere else. But my suspicion is both of those phrases just mean the something planet, right? Nalina is probably the word for planet, and he's just calling them like the big planet and the little planet, or whatever the case may be, or the Metroid planet and the planet from the second game and the planet from this game, right? But anyway, that might crop up again, and you can listen for that. You'll definitely hear the nalina at the end of it. That's kind of an interesting part as well, because I mentioned that machar was the possessive, the way that they mark possessive on pronoun, but if you were listening closely there, right, you see there's an apostrophe s on ashkar bechek, but there's no machar anywhere in there. Right, so if you listen closely again, so what he actually does there, and this is, you can go back, he says the word for plans multiple times. It's one of the easier ones to pick out, because he's talking a lot about the big bad guy's plans. But the word for plans is yoris. And Ravenbeak, he also says a ton. It's really easy to pick out as ashkar bechek. So what he actually says is ili yoris dar ashkar bechek. which is dar. You can see it's another one of those words that's doesn't have a lot of meaning on its own, but it just kind of crops up everywhere and kind of glues all the sentences together. It's a preposition, right? And specifically, it's the preposition of. So what he's saying there is not literally not Ravenbeak's plans, but the plans of Ravenbeak, which is totally grammatical English. It's not what they have written here because the subtitle is a little bit more colloquial, but totally grammatical, maybe a little highfalutin, which makes sense, you know, looking at this guy's hat. But also kind of makes you wonder, like, it might be that mukhar, as that possessive particle, only works on pronouns in Chozo, right? That could be one of the rules that they've made up for this language. Or maybe the guy or gal, I shouldn't assume, the person who was writing the script for this Chozo character deliberately wanted him to sound a little more formal here, and for whatever reason, the person writing the subtitles, maybe they read that and thought, ew, that sounds weird, and so they changed it to this. Who knows, right? All sorts of things can happen in this kind of, you know, in this kind of production with tons and tons of people. And this probably also wasn't, this scene probably wasn't where most of the language part of this wasn't where most of their budget went, but clearly somebody on the team gives a shit, right? And that's really cool. So like I was saying, yeah, we'll go back here a little bit and see if you can hear the plans of Ravenbeak, right? Remember that the word was the first one we were able to pick out is illi, and then plans, yodis, and then dar is the of word. And if you know all that, it's pretty easy to pick out.
Nutili Metroid Esporodo. Ili Yodistar Ashkar Behek. Dora Habar Bados Les Maradan. Has Bados Les Maradan.
He's also great. This is also a great little chunk of dialogue and speech. One, because we have one speaker just talking and talking and talking until, you know, Samus has a line or two here at the end, which again, super cool because it's probably more than she's said in the entire series so far. But he just repeats himself, which is something that happens all the time in natural language. But for us, it makes it really easy to pick out, like, okay, what is the phrase "laying in ruin," right? How do you say that? Well, here it is. Bados les Maradan, right? Laying in ruin. And we also, as a bonus, again, because of those good clean breaks between each of the little lines here, we also know that the yes word is has, which is a good yes word. I like that. Yeah, let's keep going. Ooh, we also got another pronoun there, right? Ata. So Anna is I or me, and Ata is you. That's kind of interesting that they're so similar. That feels like that had to have been a deliberate choice. Because again, the most basic linguistic interaction, right, is a conversation between two people. And so the two most important figures in language are me and you, right? Because I'm talking to get an idea out of my head and into your head, or vice versa, right? So I think it's kind of neat that those two pronouns are so very similar, right? That they're only different in basically two sort of characteristics of pronunciation, right? They both involve putting the tip of your tongue on what's called the alveolar ridge, which is that I've been listening to a lot of Lexicon Valley again lately, and John McWhorter has a great way of describing that, which is it's the bit that you burn when you drink your hot chocolate too fast, right? It's that little ridge right behind your teeth. So you don't, when you say Anna and Ata, at least in English, right, you don't put your tongue on your teeth, right? That would be Anna and Ata, right? Which in some languages that is how you make those sounds, but for English anyway, and for Chozo it sounds like, you put your tongue, the tip of your tongue, just a little bit further behind there, right? So it's in the same place. The two key differences are for anna, you're closing off airflow from your lungs everywhere except through your nose, right? Through your nasal cavity. So anna, that in, is what we call a nasal, right? Because you're making the sound by blowing air through your vocal tract and out your nose, right? And ata, with ata, you actually close it off completely, right? Through your mouth and your nose, right? And then you let go again. So it's ata, right? Ata. So that's one difference, right? The other difference is the voicing, right? For ata, your vocal cords aren't engaged, so they're open, which lets air flow more freely. But for anna, your vocal cords are engaged, so they're tensed together so that they kind of vibrate together, and that's what's called voiced, right? So it's the difference between, you know, d and t. Also, for example, between a D sound and a T sound in English, right? One, you have your vocal cords engaged, the other, they're not, and air flows more freely. So, let's see what else we got here in this last little bit. That part's really cool too. So maybe we should talk a little bit about some of the borrowed words, right? Because Samus Aran, I believe, is supposed to be her human name, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So it's either way, it's really interesting that he pronounces it the way that he does, right? This is the one of the few places where we get something pretty close to a T, right? He says Tammusarlan, right? I also think it's interesting that he pronounces the R so differently, right? R, and particularly the English R. One second. Yakking a lot here, so I got my T. Particularly the R in English is an R that is cross-linguistically very rare. There are very, very few languages that have an R like the one that we have in English, right? Where you say, oh, I'm feeling right as rain, right? Which is why a lot of people who learn English as a second language will struggle a lot with that R, because it's a weird way to contort your mouth and your tongue that a lot of languages just don't do. You know, famously, for example, like Japanese and a lot of other languages where they don't really have an R in the same way that we do. They will have like what's called a flap or a tap, right? So it'd be like, for them, it would be aran, and not aran or aaron, right? And for Japanese in particular, not only do they only have that sound, right? They also don't have something that's explicitly like very much like our R, but they also don't have something that's very much like our L. So they'll substitute that r, which they do have as part of their language, for both of those sounds, because it's kind of the closest thing, right? I think I've talked about this a little bit on a different stream. That's the same reason why we have the names Floyd and Lloyd in English, right? Those are both originally Welsh names, and the original name is neither of those things, right? That double L-O-Y-D, that double L in Welsh is a lla, right? It's what's called a lateral fricative. It's like if an F and an L had a baby, right? So you're making an L, but you're widening your tongue just a little bit to kind of restrict the airflow so that you're making a kind of an F-ish sound. You're making what's called a fricative with your tongue in that L position. So it's Lloyd, right? And English speakers meeting Welsh speakers for the very first time, presumably introduced themselves and said, hello, my name is Benjamin. And a guy named Lloyd said, hello, my name is Floyd. And, you know, half of the people that met that man went, that's weird, his name is Lloyd, but he says it funny. And the other half that met that guy went, that's weird, that guy's name is Floyd, but he says it funny. And after a while, enough people liked the names Lloyd and Floyd that they started using them in English as well. And there's also a whole lot more history there with the English, let's say, weren't always terribly understanding of people on the British Isles speaking languages other than English. They sort of thought that everyone ought to speak English, and that if anyone spoke anything else, that maybe some really bad things ought to happen to them. And that's why a lot of the languages that used to be spoken on the British Isles are now dead, unfortunately. Some of them we can even track down to the actual day that they died, because it's, I want to say it's Manx from the Isle of Man that we know the day that that language died, because the last speaker stepped on a landmine in World War I or something like that. So it's like the date we know. Okay, that's it. That's when we lost that one. But anyway, really far afield now. It's super interesting that he says Tamos Arlan, because that makes me think that that's her human name, and that he struggles to pronounce it because that set of sounds is literally alien to him. But he has most, if not all, of those sounds in that language. So what would be interesting would be to go back and see if he has all of those sounds in these Chozo words in those same contexts, right? Because just because you have a sound in a language doesn't mean you find it easy to say in every single context. And a good example of this for English is the TS sound, right? At the end of a word, one cat, two cats. No problem. We'll say that all day, right? Cats, bats, lats, drats, right? Totally fine. Rats. Not always with an ass sound, but whatever, I'm rhyming. But at the beginning of a word, we do not like it. We do not like it. And think about it. What's another word for a tidal wave? Well, it's tsunami, right? But how is tsunami spelled? Well, it's spelled with a T in front, a TS. And that's because in Japanese, the language that we borrowed that word from, it's not tsunami, it's tsunami, right? It's a TS up front. But in English, even though we have those sounds, we really don't like starting a word with them, right? To the point that we just dropped that first T when we borrowed the word. We said we like that word a lot. We do not like that T up front. You can keep it. But we're still going to spell it with it because this is English. And we like having fucked up spellings for words that no one can remember. It's a big spelling bee keeping that alive. So anyway, that makes me think that Samus Aran, again, it's been a really long time since I read up on a lot of the lore for Metroid, so I could be totally wrong about this, but that makes me think that Samus Aran is her human name and that he kind of struggles to pronounce it. At the same time, it's interesting that he says, and he said it a million times, so I won't backtrack to try and find it, but he says Mathroid instead of Metroid. That's kind of weird, because why would we take Mathroid and make it Metroid? Because Mathroid, nothing particularly unusual from a phonological standpoint for us as English speakers. But you do sometimes find, right, like the Floyd Lloyd thing, you do sometimes find that when people are interacting with others who speak other languages, and you do have that borrowing going on, right, where you're borrowing a word from another language, sometimes you'll assimilate it into your native phonology in sometimes weird, sometimes unpredictable ways, even though it's not terribly offensive to your native phonology to begin with. Gosh, I'll see if I can think of an example, but off the top of my head, I'm struggling with that. And sometimes it'll go the other way too, where you borrow enough words that do have weird phonology that you end up borrowing some of the phonology as well. And that's actually why we have zh sounds in English, right? That zh, as in measure and pleasure and seizure, all those words, is actually not a Germanic sound, right? That's not a sound that exists in most Germanic languages, because we borrowed it in English, right? We borrowed it from French. All of those words came over with the Normans when they invaded in 1066, and we started using enough of them that instead of saying mesha, right, which would be using more Germanic phonology, we said, no, we get it. It's a zh, not a sha. Okay, fine. Measure, right? Even though zh doesn't show up in any Germanic words, you'll borrow enough of them, and eventually your language is like, yeah, okay, cool, that's fine. Anyway, so there's some neat potential stuff to talk about here with borrowing words. Dude, it is okay. You've got 10 minutes. He's showing up on here. Show your face to the, show your big dumb face. Nobody can see you. Okay. All right, you've got to get down. Sorry about that. Yeah. All right. Let's listen to the rest of this. See what else pops up.
Ninu habar kumane humdosh devolen ili mathroidim ishkanulisa tamacharizbi.
Oh yeah.
Ata estor daburis urahama. Ana habar kisadi ilisa.
Okay, let's go back a little bit. Anyway, that's kind of the gist of it. At the end of the day, like I said, it's all English underneath here. They've just swapped out a bunch of the words, and once you know that, and you know, for example, sen is present tense. Oh, let's find the smoking gun for this ain't no Turkish, in case anyone's still holding out, thinking that it might be, which would be if we can find a spot where he uses the past tense. So actually, this is another spot where it differs a little bit from English. And that's the verb to be. So in the past tense, there's no was, were, right? I was, you were, he, she, it was, they were, y'all were, right? We were, right? There's only one form of the past tense to be that pops up here. Both was and were end up as mugi, right? Which is, while sen, there is, again, Turkish uses those suffixes for its to be, and it gets latched on to other words. There is a suffix that sounds kind of like sen. I think it's more of a sin than sen, which makes me think that maybe the person who made that first post on Reddit that I saw, where they thought, hey, this could be Turkish, because I typed what I heard into Google Translate, and this is what it said. It's definitely that person might be a Southerner, because they seem to have trouble hearing the difference between sin and sen, and I believe what he's saying here is sen. I am also a Southerner, so I could just be having trouble hearing it, and that's because for Southern American English, the distinction between I and eh, those two vowels, as in pin and pen, right? Pin, the thing that you stick cloth together with, fabric together with when you're sewing it together, and pen, the thing that has ink in it that you write with. Those two vowels in there, specifically before nasals, so as a little callback to earlier, so before sounds that you make by restricting airflow through everywhere but your nose, right? The I and the eh before nasals for speakers of English in the southern United States, that distinction is gone. They're both just I. Right, so for me, that's one of the, I don't have much of a Southern accent, but that's one of the spots where I definitely exhibit a Southern accent, is when I'm just speaking casually, I don't distinguish between pin and pen. They're both just pin to me, right? And July 4th is Independence Day. It's not Independence Day for me. So that makes me think that maybe that person who heard him say that and thought he was saying sin, which is close-ish to that Turkish suffix, when he appears to really be saying sen, maybe that person is also from the southern United States, and that's why they couldn't really pick up on that distinction. But anyway, let's go back here a little bit, because the was, were, there's a were here. It's not was, but in Chozo they're the same. They're mugi. So let's go back 10 seconds. Right, ni mugi talar. Right, that we're running. That's also another dead giveaway that this is just English under the hood, right? all of the verbal constructions, English uses a lot of phrasal verb constructions, right, that we're running, right? If you think about the way that we do, even the way that we do the future tense, and this is a broader Germanic thing, but the way that we do future tense in English is, I will go to the store, right? It's not like the past tense where you can say, I go to the store. Yesterday, I went to the store, right? You just change the verb up, right? And for regular verbs, you've got the ed thing, but either way, there's a thing on the verb attached to the verb that lets you know, oh, this is past tense versus present tense. But for future tense, you got to pull a whole extra word in there. You have to use this will thing and say, I will go to the store tomorrow. Or you can actually just use the present tense, right? You can say, I am going to the store tomorrow, right? I am going to the store right now. Present tense, I am in the process of going to the store. I'm in my car, I'm driving, somebody called me, what are you doing? I'm going to the store, right? Or I'm going to, when are you going, or what are you doing tomorrow, right? I'm going to the store. Both are present tense forms, but one is clearly denoting the future tense. Anyway, both are also phrasal constructions, right? I am going, right? Where you don't just have some form of the verb to go that means I am going. You got to pull some extra words in there. But anyway, so there's a Mugi. Let's see if we can catch a was. Also notice another potential difference here that I haven't really taken the time to dig into is he just says Metroid. He doesn't say Metroidi or Metroidu, or there's no extra ending on there to denote, like, hey, by the way, more than one Metroid. That's actually not terribly unusual, right? There's a lot of languages that don't get... English is pretty anal about marking things as singular or plural, right? There's a lot of languages where you don't have to say... I believe this might actually be another John McWhorter example. Like I said, listening to a lot of Lexicon Valley, I can't recommend that podcast enough. There's a lot of languages where it's perfectly okay to say, look at all the leaf on that tree, right? And you just understand that I'm talking about multiple leaves, right? I don't have to explicitly change the noun for you to get that, like, okay, you're not pointing at a particular leaf. I don't have to go like inspect each one until I find the one that you're talking about. You just think that all the leaves on that tree look pretty. That's fine, right? But in English, if you don't make that plural, it sounds weird. So it might be that Chozo is a little bit more lax with its singulars and its plurals. Which could again just be a result of the budget that was given to whoever this person or a group of people were that cared enough to come up with all these words. Maybe that was one of the things that they struck, right? They were trying to avoid scope creep. I know a little bit about software development and how that all works, right? Somebody gives you a time and a budget, and you've only got so much time to come up with words and grammatical constructions and all this sort of stuff. So you say, all right, it's just English underneath, and then we'll throw some words on top. And somebody says, okay, we've got a word for was, but what about were? And you go, shit, just use the same word again, right? We don't have time to come up with another one. We got other shit to do. It could have been that kind of situation. Or maybe it's a very deliberate choice where they've decided that, no, actually, Chozo just doesn't care as much about singular and plural. Or maybe this particular noun in Chozo has a null plural in the same way that in English we have null plurals on some words. Right, so it's 1 deer, but it's also 27 deer, right? It used to be that English had a lot more of those weird other plurals besides just s, but over time they've all kind of, for the most part, gone to that s form, right? And you see some other, right, mice, right? That's a good old Germanic umlaut plural, that sort of thing. Brother, brethren. Brother is an interesting one because it's one where we actually have multiple plurals, right? Brother, brothers, there's your regular one, but brother and brethren, that's the old school plural. And interestingly, the more archaic plural is kind of restricted. Like, I wouldn't, if I had 2 male siblings, I would not refer to them as my brethren, right? That would be weird. You would assume I was in a cult. But if I was a monk in a monastery talking about my other monk friends in the monastery with me, I might refer to them as my brethren, because in that more ceremonial religious context, that old school plural, that kind of makes sense. Anyway, I said we were going to find a was because we've heard a were. Then there's a was right there, but I probably talked over it. Let's back up a little bit. Right? He's, as we often do with little words like the verb for to be, he talks over it pretty quickly, goes past it pretty quickly, but you can hear that mugi in there if you listen very closely. Let's see, if we back up 10 seconds, we might get both of them back to back here. So our intention was mugi, but also were in the previous sentence is also mugi. Right? Ooh, no, I was wrong. I completely forgot about that bit. So I mentioned, I'm wrong about something else. I'm right about the Mugi thing, but I mentioned earlier that for SR388 and for ZDR, he says both times the ili, something, and then nalina. And I said, that's probably the word for planet. But we actually have the word for planet there at the very end of that utterance, and it's not nalina, it's something else. Let's see if we can see what it is. Ili huridis. Huh. Yeah, so I don't, maybe world, maybe, I don't know. That's interesting. Because he's definitely, for SR388 and for ZDR, he definitely says the something something. He's not saying, it doesn't sound like he's saying, you know, the letter S, the letter R, and, you know, the number 388. I thought it was the planet word, but it's definitely not. Because we have the planet word there, and it's not Nalina. Another dead giveaway that this is English, right? Earlier, he talks about, very early on, he talks about the Tocha tribe took, maybe it was the Malkan tribe took me, blah, 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 blah. And the verb there for took is chasadi. English loves the verb to take, right? It's undergone a process that is called semantic bleaching, where literally, what does the word to take mean, right? Well, it means you have something, I want it, so I get it from your possession into my possession. I have taken it. I took it. Right? That is to take, right? Maybe it's not, you know, in your possession. Maybe it's just lying on the ground, right? And I take it, right? But over time, English, excuse me one second. Over time, English has started to use that verb to take almost like a helping verb, right? You can literally take something, right? But you can also take your time. You can take a break. You can take a nap, right? Take a nap? The hell does that mean, right? Was someone in possession of the nap before you went and took it from them and now you're asleep? Do you have to like fight someone and wrestle the nap away from them before you can get a little shut eye there? No, it's that semantic bleaching, right? It's almost a helping verb now. It doesn't actually always mean its literal meaning anymore. It's become used in just dozens and dozens of different little idioms where it just denotes that there's some action taking place, and really the noun in those phrases tells you a lot more about what take is supposed to mean than take does, right? Take your time. Oh, okay. That means you've got a lot more time, right? I'm telling you, you have time, right? You can go slowly, that sort of thing. Take a nap. Oh, okay. I'm going to sleep, right? And you don't have to go far, right? Even in German, for example, right? There's definitely some cases where if you literally translate things from English into German, you're gonna sound weird, right? One of the things, and some of this might sound a little bit more okay for younger speakers, just because English. My gut instinct here was to say that English pollutes everything, but that's not fair. That's very judgmental. But you know, Hollywood's everywhere. Everybody saw those Avenger films, right? So English Anglicisms make their way into other languages pretty frequently, just because English has a lot of political clout and influence around the world as a language, right? It's a very, if not the, I'm pretty sure it's still the most common second language. Definitely not the most common first language, but most common second language. Anyway, if you translate, for example, to take the bus, right? There's another great example, right? How'd you get to school yesterday? Oh, I took the bus. Well, if you take that very literally, it kind of sounds like you stole, like you had a little GTA moment and you stole the bus. That's not what you mean, though, right? You mean you walked to the bus stop, you waited for it to show up, you popped on, you sat down, and you let the bus driver do his thing, and then you got off at a stop. What about that is taking, right? Take seems like such a strong verb to use for that particular action, but it's 100% proper colloquial English, right? We say that sort of thing all the time. But in German, if somebody asks you, well, how'd you get to school yesterday? And you say, you know, ich hab den Bus genommen, right? I took the bus. You know, really, unless they're way out in the middle of nowhere, what they're probably going to immediately assume is, oh, this dumb American learning German isn't that cute, and they'll say, okay, cool, I gotcha. And they might say, du bist mit dem Bus gefahren, right? Because in German, what you say is literally, I drove or I rode with the bus, or by means of the bus. You don't say I took the bus, because if you say I took the bus, it kind of sounds like what it literally means, i.e., you know, I saw a bus pull up, the bus driver got out to take a smoke break, and so I got on and got behind the wheel, and now here I am. Because, you know, even our closely related languages, like you know, German and Dutch and all those other Germanic languages, haven't seen the verb take undergo that kind of change. So when you see take in here, and it's used in that sort of helping verb construction, another dead giveaway that this is just English underneath. Right? Did you hear that? Chasadi, that to take verb. He took extreme measures. Where did he take them to? Well, no, that's not what that means, right? It means that it's to the point, it's so ingrained in English that it's hard to even like circumlocute around that. It's hard to define it without just using another take expression, right? Took extreme measures means he did some wild shit, right? It doesn't have anything to do. It could have something to do with taking, right? Maybe it involved stealing a magical object. I don't know, but it does not necessarily imply that, right? Take is really just kind of a helping verb there, right? So listen to it again. You've got that chasadi verb. You've also got that good dosh there as the two. Yeah. Anyway, we've been yakking about this Chozo stuff. And by we, I mean I, obviously. Been yakking about this Chozo stuff for quite a while. I think this is super cool. This was my favorite part of the whole game. And I really liked the game. It's gotten some less than favorable press here and there, because it's definitely not... One, it's hard. It's harder than I remember even Super Metroid being. But I also played Super Metroid a ton when I was a kid and had all the time in the world and had better reflexes and wasn't this old husk of a human that you see in front of you. But it's hard, but also there's like a half dozen different instances where the critical path involves just finding seemingly randomly placed destructible blocks with no clear indication that they're there most of the time. still, it plays super well. It controls take a little getting used to, especially if the last Metroid game that you played was one of those GBA ones, right? Or even the Super Nintendo one, but it controls pretty well once you get used to it. The movement is super fluid. The animations are great. The style is great. Like, Samus has such cool personality, and she speaks Chozo, which is neat, right? That's such a great way. They could have just had Quiet Robe speak English and made him sound funny, and that would have been enough for most games. But I think the fact that they went through the extra effort to write out that Chozo dictionary, to, you could view it as maybe cutting costs and cutting some production corners with some of the ways that the Chozo, this language that they've come up with, is more regular than English. That's a nice way to say it's got fewer forms to worry about. So there's less to come up with. But the fact that they went through all that trouble, there's a couple of spots, I think I pointed out one of them, where like they forget the mukhar, right? So they don't have a possessive marker on a possessive pronoun. But for the most part, it's super consistent, right? The lines were clearly rehearsed. I don't know if that was a professional voice actor or if that was like a get Bob from accounting kind of deal, like they used to do in the old days when voice acting wasn't nearly as standard as it was. It certainly didn't have the budget that it does now for a lot of games. But the fact that they gave him his own language and then had Samus also speak that back to him, right, is super rad, because that's a big part of Samus's backstory, right? Is that she was, human living on a planet that was, I believe, destroyed, if not raided, by the space pirates. And the Chozo sort of took her in, right? So she's spent a lot of time amongst the Chozo, and it makes sense that she would have learned their language. I love the script that they've done. There's not a lot of it in the game. It's in places, like it's on this guy's robes, on his scarf, whatever that is, coming out of his epaulets. It's on the heat vents that you turn off on in the game. It's in the sort of the teleporter beams. There's like Chozo characters that'll pop up here and there. I've done a little bit of looking. I haven't found any good sources on like a complete version of that alphabet, and it doesn't really show up enough to start taking guesses at what those characters might symbolize, whether it's an alphabet and it's basically just kind of a cipher for the Roman alphabet, or whether it's more of like a syllabary, or whether it's something really cool like the modern Korean alphabet. But it's neat. They put a lot of time and care into making this language feel real. And it's a, you can go multiple directions, right? I mentioned earlier how one way to do it is to just go the Sims route and just have, a bunch of voice actors get really animated and speak a bunch of gibberish into a microphone, and say, okay, now say the sad gibberish. Okay, cool. Now say the happy gibberish, right? And it works for that game, right? It's totally fine. You don't need to believe that there's a whole world of Sims with like deep societies and all that sort of stuff. That's not what that game is about. That's fine. Right? It's about being like having goofy little people that you sometimes do horrible things to. Like, I think everybody who's played The Sims has at some point or another done something like like build a pool for them and then take the ladder out of the pool after they get in, right? Or something like that, right? It's there's some dark things that happen in The Sims. But yeah, it's the language doesn't really matter, right? So it's just gibberish. The other end of the spectrum is something like, Dothraki in Game of Thrones, where that is a language that was built by a linguist, and he didn't just build the language and say, okay, here you go, you're done. He actually built sort of a proto version of the language, an earlier version of the language that isn't used anywhere in the show, and then said, okay, if we say this is what it was like 1,000 years ago, and then over the centuries, this change happened, this sound change happened, this grammatical construction got simpler, right? This, that, and the other thing. He basically aged it, right? Like it was cheese or something. And then that aged version became the more modern Dothraki that they put in the show. That's a ton of effort. I guarantee you Nintendo is not as paying for that, especially for the Metroid franchise, which historically they've not really seen as one of their major tentpole franchises, right? It's not always done super well in Japan. This one is apparently doing very well, which is good. It was great news because I've always loved this series, but they've not always seen it as one of their major tentpoles. So it's totally understandable that this was given to Mercury Steam. This isn't developed by Nintendo proper, right? It's given to another developer. And it's totally understandable that they wouldn't want to put in the effort for that one cutscene, which is a decent chunk of budget. I have to think, because it's a good long cutscene there. It's like 5 or 6 minutes. But it makes sense that they wouldn't want to hire a linguist to go all J.R.R. Tolkien on it, right? So they did a nice compromise, right, where they took an existing grammar that presumably somebody on the staff knew, namely the English grammar, and they took a bunch of words and they said, all right, we're just going to swap them out for these made up Chozo words that we have, and call it a day. And it works super well, right? It's if you're looking for it, it's obvious, right? Once you hear it, you can't not hear it, but it gives it that feeling of authenticity. It feels like a real language because it kind of is under the hood, right? So anyway, that's I hope you found that interesting. I haven't streamed in a while. We're gonna get back to the Persona 5 run through where we do monster etymologies and all that sort of fun stuff. Life has just been crazy lately, but hopefully next Tuesday I'll get back to that. It's probably the next episode will probably be a lot of the day in the life stuff, so I'll just be commenting on whatever folks are saying. I don't think we'll make it to the mementos, and I'm fairly certain we won't make it to the second palace, so we'll just have to see. But I got the Persona wikis up here, looking through upcoming monsters so that I can, for the ones that I don't know, which it looks like will be a lot of them for the next set, for the ones that I don't know, I can do a little bit of research and come up with where they came from, because I think it's neat to see where people pull this kind of world building stuff from. And this Metroid one, Metroid is the last series that I thought I would be talking about the linguistics of Metroid. Bonkers. But this has been pretty cool. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. There's a lot more there. I might throw together a Chozo dictionary and put it on one of the Metroid fan wikis and see if they accept it, because there's a decent chunk of language there, and maybe somebody can use that to do some more fun stuff with. Might follow this up with a talk about phonology in Chozo, because there's some interesting stuff there. I talked a little bit about it with the borrowings and stuff, but there's also some kind of xenolinguistic stuff to talk about. Like, there's a lot of B sounds in that language, but that dude doesn't have any lips. He's a bird man. He's got a beak. So how does he make a B sound that requires lips? But there's some sneaky ways around that where it might actually work. Anyway, that's all I got for tonight. I hope you enjoyed. Stay tuned for more. If you're watching this on YouTube, I'll put this up on YouTube, but feel free to follow me at the Twitch link in the description. I stream usually twice a week, but it's been a little bit crazy lately, but stream twice a week. Just kind of play games, talk about language and linguistics. I try to play games that, have some language in them to talk about, which is why I streamed this Metroid stuff kind of on an off day, but also I streamed the Metroid stuff because I love the Metroid series. So this was a great surprise, both in terms of being a really good 2D Metroid game that we haven't had in a very long time outside of that 3DS one, and all this language. That's so cool. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you later.